Good wishes to all of you. Textbook in History for Class 12. Themes in Indian History Part 1. Theme 2. Kings, Farmers and Towns. Early States and Economies. C 600 BCE to 600 CE. Take a look at figure 2.1. An inscription Sanchi, Madhya Pradesh. C. 2nd century BCE. Epigraphy is the study of inscriptions. There are several developments in different parts of the subcontinent during the long span of 1500 years following the end of the Harappan civilization. This was also the period during which the Rigveda was composed by people living along the Indus and its tributaries. Agricultural settlements emerged in many parts of the subcontinent, including North India, the Deccan Plateau, and parts of Karnataka. Besides, there is evidence of pastoral population in the Deccan and further south. New modes of disposal of the dead, including the making of elaborate stone structures known as megalithics, emerged in central and South India from the first millennium BCE. In many cases, the dead were buried with a rich range of iron tools and weapons. From c. 6th century BCE, there is evidence that there were other trends as well. Perhaps the most visible was the emergence of early states, empires, and kingdoms. Underlining these political processes were other changes evident in the ways in which agriculture production was organized. Simultaneously, new towns appeared almost throughout the subcontinent. Historians attempt to understand these developments by drawing on a range of sources, inscriptions, texts, coins, and visual materials. As we will see, this is a complex process. You will also notice that these sources do not tell the entire story. Princip and Pedasi. Some of the most developments in India epigraphy took place in the 1830s. This was when James Princip, an officer in the mint of the East India Company, deciphered Brahmi and Kharoshthi, two scripts used in the earliest inscriptions and coins. He found that most of these mentioned a king referred to as Piyadasi, meaning pleasant to behold. There were a few inscriptions which also referred to the king as Ashoka, one of the most famous rulers known from Buddhist texts. This gave a new direction to investigations into early Indian political history as European and Indian scholars used inscriptions and texts composed in a variety of languages to reconstruct the lineages of major dynasties that had ruled the subcontinent. As a result, the broad contours of political history were in place by the early decades of the 12th century. Subsequently, scholars began to shift their focus to the context of political history investigating whether there were connections between political changes and economic and social developments. It was soon realized that while there were links, these were not always simple or direct. Inscriptions. Inscriptions are writing engraved on hard surfaces such as stone, metal, or pottery. They usually record the achievements, activities, or ideas of those who commissioned them and include the exploits of kings or donations made by women and men to religious institutions. Inscriptions are virtually permanent record, some of which carry dates, others are dated on the basics of paleography or styling of writing with a fair amount of precision. For instance, in 1250 BCE, the letter A was written like this. By the by c 500 CE, it was written like this. The earliest inscriptions were in Prakrit, a name for languages used by ordinary people. Names of rulers such as Ajatasattu and Ashoka, known from Prakrit texts and inscriptions, have been spelt in their Prakrit forms. In this chapter, you will also find terms in languages such as Pali, Tamil, and Sanskrit, which two were used to write inscriptions and texts. It is possible that people spoke in other languages as well, even though these were not used for writing. Janapada means the land where a jana, a people, clan, or tribe sets its foot or settles. It is a word used in both Prakrit and Sanskrit. The earliest states, the 16 Mahajanapadas. The 6th century BC is often regarded as a major turning point in early Indian history. It is an era associated with early states, cities, the growing use of iron, the development of coinage, etc. It also witnessed the growth of diverse systems of thought, including Buddhism and Jainism. Early Buddhist and Jaina texts, see also chapter 4, mention amongst other things 16 states known as Mahajanapadas. Although the lists vary, some names such as Vajji, Magadha, Kosala, Kuru, Panchala, Gandhara, and Avanti occur frequently. Clearly, these were amongst the most important Mahajanapadas. While most Mahajanapadas were ruled by kings, some known as Ganas or Sanghas, were oligarchies Pestati, where power was shared by a number of men, often collectively called Rajas. Both Mahavira and the Buddha, chapter 4, belonged to such Ganas. In some instances, such as in the case of the Vajji Sangha, the Rajas probably controlled resources such as land collectively, although their histories are often difficult to reconstruct due to the lack of sources. Some of these states lasted for nearly 1,000 years. Each Mahajanapada had a capital city which was often fortified, maintaining these fortified cities as well as providing for incipient armies and bureaucracies required sources from c. 6th century BC onwards. Brahmanas began composing Sanskrit texts known as the Dharma Sutras. These laid down norms for rulers as well as for other social categories who were ideally expected to be Kshatriyas. See also chapter 3. Rulers were advised to collect taxes and tribute from cultivators. Traders and artisans were resources also procured from pastoralists and forest peoples. We do not really know. What we do know is that rights on neighboring states were recognized as a legitimate means of acquiring wealth. Gradually, some states acquired standing armies and maintained regular bureaucracies. Others continued to depend on militia, recruited more often than not from the peasantry. Take a look at map 1, early states and their capitals. Which were the areas where states and cities were most densely clustered? Oligarchy refers to a form of government where power is exercised by a group of men. The Roman Republic, about which you read last year, was an oligarchy in spite of its name. Discuss what are the different explanations offered by early writers and present day historians for the growth of Magadhan power. Take a look at figure 2.2, fortification walls at Rajgir. Why were these walls built? First among us is 16, Magadha. Between the 6th and the 4th centuries BCE, Magadha in present day Bihar became the most powerful Mahajanapadas. Modern historians explain this development in a variety of ways. Magadha was a region where agriculture was especially productive. Besides iron mines in present day Jharkhand were accessible and provided resources for tools and weapons. Elephants, an important component of the army, were found in forest in the region. Also, the Ghana and its tributaries provided a means of cheap and convenient communication. However, early Buddhist and Jaina writers who wrote about Magadha attributed its power to the policies of individuals ruthlessly ambitious kings of whom Bimbisara, Ajatasattu, and Mahapadmananda are the best known, and their ministers who helped implement their policies. Initially, Rajgaha, the Prakrit name for present day Rajgir in Bihar, was the capital of Magadha. Interestingly, the old names means house of the King. Rajagaha was a fortified settlement located amongst hills. Later in the 4th century BCE, the capital was shifted to Pataliputra, present-day Patna, commanding routes of communication, communication along the Ganga. Language and scripts. Most Ashokan inscriptions were in the Prakrit language, while those in the northwest of the subcontinent were in Aramaic and Greek. Most Prakrit inscriptions were written in the Brahmi script, however, some in the northwest were written in Kharosthi. The Aramaic and Greek scripts were used for inscriptions of Afghanistan. Take a look at figure 2.3, the lion capital. Why is the lion capital considered important today? An early empire, the growth of Magadha culminated in the emergence of the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the empire c. 321 BCE, extended control as far northwest as Afghanistan and Balochistan, and his grandson Ashoka, arguably the most famous ruler of early India, conquered Kalinga, present-day coastal Orissa. Finding out about the Mauryans, historians have used a variety of sources to reconstruct the history of the Mauryan Empire. These include archaeological finds, especially sculpture. Also valuable are contemporary works such as the account of Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta Maurya, which survives in fragments. Another source that is often used is the Ardhashastra, parts of which were probably composed by Kautilya or Chanakya, traditionally believed to be the minister of Chandragupta. Besides, the Mauryans are mentioned in later Buddhist, Jaina, and Puranic literature, as well as in Sanskrit literary works. While these are useful, the inscriptions of Ashoka c. 27 2 by 268 268 to 231 BC on rocks and pillars are often regarded as amongst the most valuable sources. Ashoka was the first ruler who inscribed his message to his subjects and officials on stone surfaces, natural rocks, as well as polished pillars. He used the inscriptions to proclaim what he understood to be Dhamma. These included respect towards elders, generosity towards Brahmanas and those who renounced worldly life, treating slaves and servants kindly, and respect for religions and traditions other than one's own. Administering the empire, there were five major political centers in the empire: the capital Pataliputra and the provincial centers of Taxila, Ujjaini, Tosli, and Suvarnagari, all mentioned in Ashokan inscriptions. If we examine the content of these inscriptions, we find virtually the same message engraved everywhere from the present-day northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan to Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and Uttarakhand in India. Could this vast empire have had a uniform administrative system? Historians have increasingly come to realize that this is unlucky. The regions included within the empire were just too diverse. Imagine the contrast between the hilly terrain of Afghanistan and the coast of Orissa. Take a look at map to distribution of Ashokan inscriptions. Could rulers have engraved inscriptions areas that were not included within their empire? It is likely that administrative control was strongest in areas around the capital and the provincial centers. These centers were carefully chosen, both Taxila and Ujjaini being situated on important long distance trade routes. While Suvarnagari, literally the Golden Mountain, was possibly important for tapping the gold mines of Karnataka. Communication along both land and riverine routes was vital for the existence of the empire. Journeys from the center to the provinces could have taken weeks, if not months. This meant arranging for provisions as well as protection for those who were on the move. It is obvious that the army was an important means of ensuring the later. Megasthenes mentioned a committee with six subcommittees for coordinating military activity. Of these, one looked after the navy, the second managed transport and provisions, the third was responsible for foot soldiers, the fourth for horses, the fifth for chariots, and the sixth for elephants. The activities of the second subcommittee were rather varied, arranging for bullock carts to carry equipment, procuring food for soldiers and fodder for animals, and recruiting servants and artisans to look after the soldiers. Ashoka also tried to hold his empire together by propagating Dhamma, the principles of which, as we have seen, were simple and virtually universally applicable. This, according to him, would ensure the well being of people in this world and the next. Special offers, known as the Dhamma Mahamatta, were appointed to spread the message of Dhamma. What the king's official did. Here is an excerpt from the account of Megasthenes of the great officers of state. Some superintend the rivers, measure the land as is done in Egypt, and inspect the sluices by which water is let out from the main canals into their branches, so that everyone may have an equal supply of it. The same person have charge also of the huntsmen and are entrusted with the power of rewarding or punishing them according to their deserts. They collect the taxes and superintend the occupations connected with land, as those of the woodcutters, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, and the miners. Why were officials appointed to supervise these occupational groups? Discuss. Read the excerpts from Megasthenes and the Ardhashastra, source 1 and 2. To what extent do you think these texts are useful in reconstructing a history of Mauryan administration? How important was the empire? When historians began reconstructing early Indian history in the 19th century, the emergence of the Mauryan Empire was regarded as a major landmark. India was then under colonial rule and was part of the British Empire. 19th and early 20th century Indian historians found the possibility that there was an empire in early India, both challenging and exciting. Also, some of the archaeological finds associated with the Mauryas, including stone sculpture, were considered to be examples of the specular art typical of empires. Many of these historians found the message or Ashokan inscriptions very different from that of most other rulers, suggesting that Ashoka was more powerful and industrious, as also more humble than later rulers who adopted grandiose titles. So it is not surprisingly that nationalist leaders in the 20th century regarded him as an inspiring figure. Yet, how important was the Mauryan Empire? It lasted for about 150 years, which is not a very long time in the vast span of the history of the subcontinent. Besides, if you look at map 2, you will notice that the empire did not encompass the entire subcontinent, and even within the frontiers of the empire, control was not uniform. By the 2nd century BC, new chiefdoms and kingdoms emerged in several parts of the subcontinent. New notions of kingship. Chiefs and kings in the south, the new kings that emerged in the Deccan and further south, including the chiefdoms of the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas in Tamilakam, the name of the ancient Tamil country, which included part of present day Andhra Pradesh and Kerala in addition to Tamil Nadu, provided to be stable and prosperous. Chiefs and chiefdoms. A chief is a powerful man whose position may or may not be hereditary. He derives support from his kin- kinfolk. His functions may include performing special rituals, leadership in warfare, and arbitrate, arbitrating disputes. He receives gifts from his subordinates, unlike kings who usually collect taxes. and often distributes these among its supporters generally. There are no regular armies and officials in chiefdoms. Capturing elephants for the army. The Arthashastra lays down minute details of administrative and military organization. This is what it says about how to capture elephants. Guards of elephant forests, assisted by those who rear elephants, those who enchain the legs of elephants, those who guard the boundaries, those who live in forests, as well as by those who nurse elephants, shall, with the help of 5 or 7 female elephants to help in tethering wild ones, trace the whereabouts of herds of elephants by following the course of urine and dung left by elephant. According to Greek sources, the Mauryan ruler had a standing army of 6 lakh foot soldiers, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 elephants. Some historians consider these accounts to be exaggerated. If the Greek accounts were true, what kinds of resources do you think the Mauryan ruler would have required to maintain such a large army? We know about these states from a variety of sources. For instance, the early Tamil Sangam's texts. See also chapter 3 contain poems describing chiefs and the ways in which they acquired and distributed resources. Many chiefs and kings, including the Shatavahanas who ruled over parts of western and central India, 2nd century BC, 2nd century CE, and the Shakas, a people of Central Asian origin who established kingdoms in the northwestern and western parts of the subcontinent, derived revenues from long distances trade. Their social origins were often obscure, but as we will see in the case of the Shatavahanas chapter 3, once they acquired power, they attempted to claim social status in a variety of ways. Take a look at figure 2.4, a Kushana coin obverse King Kanishka reveres a deity. How has the king been portrayed? The Pandya chief Senguthuvan visits the forest. This is an excerpt from the Shilpadikaram, an epic written in Tamil. When he visited the forest, people came down the mountain singing and dancing just as the defeated show respect to the victorious king. So did they bring gifts, ivory, fragrant wood, fans made of the hair of deer, honey, sandalwood, red orch, antimony, turmeric, cardamom, pepper, etc. They brought coconuts, mangoes, medicinal plants, fruits, onions, sugarcane, flowers, areca nut, bananas, baby tigers, lions, elephants, monkeys, bear, deer, musk deer, fox, peacocks, musk cat, wild cocks, speaking parrots, etc. Why did people bring these gifts? What would they what would the chief have used these for? Divine king. One means of claiming high status was to identify with a variety of deities. The strategy is best exemplified by the Kushanas. 1st century BC, 1st century CE, who ruled over a vast kingdom extending from Central Asia to northwest India. Their history has been reconstructed from inscriptions and textual traditions. The notions of kingship they wished to protect are perhaps best evidenced in their coins and sculpture. Colossal statues of Kushana rulers have been found installed in a shrine at Matner, Mathura, Uttar Pradesh. Similar statues have been found in a shrine in Afghanistan as well. Some historians feel this indicates that the Kushanas considered themselves godlike. Many Kushana rulers also adopted the title Devaputra or son of God, possibly inspired by Chinese rulers who called themselves sons of heaven. By the 4th century, there is evidence of larger states, including the Gupta Empire. Many of these depended on Samantas, men who maintained themselves through local resources, including control over land. They offered homage and provided military support to rulers. Powerful Samantas could become kings. Conversely, weak rulers might find themselves being reduced to positions of subordination. Histories of the Gupta rulers have been reconstructed from literature, coins, and inscriptions, including prashastis composed in praise of kings in particular, and patrons in general by poets, while historians often attempt to draw factual information from such compositions. Those who composed and read them often treasure them as works of poetry rather than as accounts that were literally true. The Prayaga Prashasti, also known as the Allahabad Pillar inscription, composed in Sanskrit by Harisena, the court poet of Samudragupta, arguably the most powerful of the Gupta rulers, say 4th century to c, is a case in point. Take a look at figure 2.5, sandstone sculpture of a Kushana king. What are the elements in this sculpture that suggest that this is an image of a king? Discuss why do you think kings claim divine status? In praise of Samudragupta, this is an excerpt from the Prayaga Prashasti. He was without an antagonist on earth. He, by the overflowing of the multitude of his many good qualities, adorned by hundreds of good actions, has wiped off the fame of other kings with the soles of his feet. He is Purusha, the supreme being the case of the prosperity of the god and the destruction of the bad. He is incomparable. He is one whose tender heart can be captured only by devotion and humility. He is possessor of compassion. He is the giver of many hundred thousands of cows. His mind has received ceremonial intuition for the uplift of the miserable, the poor, the forlorn, and the suffering. He is just resplendent and embodied kindness to mankind. He is equal to the gods, Kubera, the god of wealth, Varuna, the god of the ocean, Indra, the god of rains, and Yama, the god of death. The Sudarshana, beautiful lake in Gujarat. Find Girnar on map 2. The Sudarshana lake was an artificial reservoir. We know about it from the rock inscription 2nd century CE. In Sanskrit, composed to record the achievements of the Shaka ruler Rudradamman. The inscription mentioned that the lake with the embankments and water channels was built by a local governor during the rule of the Mauryas. However, a terrible storm broke the embankments and water gushed out of the lake. Rudradaman, who was then ruling in the area, claimed to have got the lake repaired using his own resources without imposing any tax on his subjects. Another inscription on the same rock, 5th century, mentions how one of the rulers of the Gupta dynasty got the lake repaired once again. Why did rulers make arrangements for irrigation? Transplantation is used for paddy cultivation in areas where water is plentiful. Here, seeds are first broadcast. When the saplings have grown, they are transplanted in waterlogged fields. This ensures a higher ratio of survival of saplings and higher yields. A changing countryside. Popular perceptions of kings. What did subjects think about these rulers? Obviously, inscriptions do not provide all the answers. In fact, ordinary people rarely left accounts of their thoughts and experiences. Nevertheless, historians have tried to solve this problem by examining stories contained in anthologies such as the Jatakas and the Panchatantra. Many of these stories probably originated as popular oral tales that were later committed to writing. The Jatakas were written in Pali around the middle of the first millennium CE. One story known as the Gandhan, Gandhathindu Jataka describes the plight of the subjects of a wicked king. These included elderly women and men, cultivators, herders, village boys, and even animals. When the king went in disgust to find out what his subjects thought about him, each one of them cursed him for their miseries, complaining that they were attacked by robbers at night and by tax collectors during the day. To escape from this situation, people abandoned their village and went to live in the forest. As the story indicates, the relationship between a king and his subjects, especially the rural population, could often be strained. Kings frequently tried to fill their coffers by demanding high taxes, and peasants particularly found such demands oppressive. Escaping into the forest remained an option. As reflected in the Jataka story, meanwhile, other strategies aimed at increasing production to meet growing demand for taxes also came to be adopted. Strategies for increasing production. One such strategy was the shift to plug agriculture, which spread in fertile alluvial river valleys such as those of the Ganga and the Kaveri from c. 6th century BCE. The iron tipped plugshers were used to turn the alluvial soil in areas which had high rainfall. Moreover, in some parts of the Ganga Valley, production of paddy was dramatically increased by the introduction of transplantation, although this meant back-breaking work for the producer. While the iron flexure led to a growth in agriculture productivity, its use was restricted to certain parts of the subcontinent. Cultivators in areas which were semi arid, such as parts of Punjab and Rajasthan, did not adopt it till the 12th century, and those living in hilly tracts in the northeastern and central parts of the subcontinent practiced hoe agriculture, which was much better situated to the terrain. Another strategy adopted to increase agriculture production was the use of irrigation through wells and tanks, and less commonly canals. Communities as well as individuals organized the construction of irrigation works. The later, usually powerful men, including kings, often recorded such activities in inscriptions. Differences in rural society. While these technologies often led to an increase in production, the benefits were very uneven. What is evident is that there was a growing differentiation amongst people engaged in agriculture. Stories, especially within the Buddhist tradition, refer to landless agricultural laborers, small peasants as well as large landholders. The term Gahapati was often used in Pali text to designate the second and third categories. The large landholders as well as the village headman, whose position was often hereditary, emerged as powerful figures and often exercised control over other cultivators. Early Tamil literature, the Sangam text also mentioned different categories of people living in the villages: large landowners or Vellalar, plugman or Uzwar, and slaves or Admai. It is likely that these differences were based on differential access to land, labor, and some of the new technologies. In such a situation, questions of control over land must have become crucial, as these were often discussed in legal texts. The importance of boundaries. The Manusmriti is one of the best known legal texts of early India, written in Sanskrit and compiled between 2nd century BCE and c. 2nd century CE. That this is what the text advises the king to do, saying that in the world controversies constantly arise due to the ignorance of boundaries. He should have concealed boundary markers, buried stones, bones, cow's hair, calf, ashes, potsherds, dried cow dung, brick, coal, pebbles, and sand. He should also have other similar substances that would not decay in the soil, buried as hidden markers at the intersection of boundaries. Would these boundary markers have been adequate to resolve disputes? Gahpati. A Gahpati was the owner, master, or head of a household who exercised control over the women, children, slaves, and workers who shared a common residence. He was also the owner of the resources, land, animals, and other things that belonged to the households. Sometimes the term was used as a marker of status for men belonging to the urban elite, including wealthy merchants. Life in a small village. The Harsha Charitra is a biography of Harshavardhana, the ruler of Kanauj, see map 3, composed in Sanskrit by his court poet Banabhatta, 7th century CE. This is an excerpt from this text, an extremely rare representation of life in a settlement on the outskirts of a forest in the Vindhyas. The outskirts being for the most part forest, many parcels of rice land, threshing ground, and arable land were being apportioned by small farmers. It was mainly spade culture, owing to the difficulty of plugging the sparsely scattered fields covered with grass, with their few clear spaces, their black soil stiff as black iron. There were people moving along with the bundles of bark, countless sacks of plucked flowers, loads of flax and hemp bundles, quantities of honey, peacocks' tail features, wreaths of rags, logs, and grass. Village wives hastened and route for neighboring villages, all intent on thoughts of sale and bearing on their heads basket filled with various gathered forest fruits. How would you classify the people described in the text in terms of their occupation? Land grants and new rural elites. From the early centuries of the Common Era, we find grants of land being made, many of which were recorded in inscriptions. Some of these inscriptions were on stone, but most were on copper plates. Take a look at figure 2.13, which were probably given as a record of the transaction to those who received the land. The records that have survived are generally about grants to religious institutions or to Brahmanas. Most inscriptions were in Sanskrit in some cases, and especially from the 17th century, 7th century onwards. Part of the inscription was in Sanskrit while the rest was in a local language such as Tamil or Telugu. Let us look at one such inscription more closely. Prabhavati Gupta was the daughter of one of the most important rulers in early Indian history, Chandragupta II, say 375 to 415 CE. She was married into another important ruling family, that of the Vakatakas, who were powerful in the Deccan. See map 3. According to Sanskrit legal text, women were not supposed to have independent access to resources such as land. However, the inscription indicates that Prabhavati had access to land, which she then granted. This may have been because she was a queen, one of the few known from early Indian history, and her situation was therefore exceptional. It is also possible that the provisions of legal texts were not uniformly implemented. The inscription also gives us an idea about rural populations. These included Brahmanas and peasants, as well as others who were expected to provide a range of produce to the king or his representatives. And according to the inscription, they would have to obey the new lord of the village and perhaps pay him all these dues. Land grants such as this one have been found in several parts of the country. There were regional variations in the sizes of land donated, ranging from small plots to vast stretches of uncultivated land, and the rights given to donees, the recipients of the grant. The impact of land grants is a subject of heated debate among historians. Some feel that land grants were part of a strategy adopted by ruling lineages to extend agriculture to new areas. Others suggest that land grants were indicative of weakening political power. As kings were losing control over their samantas, they tried to win allies by making general grants of land. They also feel that kings tried to project themselves as a superman, as we saw in the previous section. Because they were losing control, they wanted to present at least a facet of power. And Agrahara was land granted to a Brahmana who was usually exempted from paying land revenue and other dues to the king, and was often given the right to collect these Jews from the local people. Source 8. Prabhavati Gupta and the village of Danguna. This is what Prabhavati Gupta states in her inscription. Prabhavati Gupta commands the Grama Kutumbinas, householders, peasants living in the village, Brahmanas and other living in the village of Danguna. Be it Be it known to you that on the 12th lunar day of the bright fortnight of Kartika, we have, in order to increase our religious merit, donated this village with the pouring out of water to the Acharya, teacher. Chanlasavamin, you should obey all his commands. We confer on him the following exemptions typical of an agrahara. This village is not to be entered by soldiers and policemen. It is exempt from the obligation to provide grass, animal hides as seeds, and charcoal to touring royal officers, exempt from the royal prerogative of purchasing fermenting liquors and digging salt, exempt from the right to mines and Khadira trees, exempt from the obligation to supply flowers and milk. It is donated together with the right to hidden treasures and deposits and together with major and minor taxes. This charter has been this charter has been written in the 13th regnal year. It has been engraved by Chakradhasa. What were the things produced in the village? Discuss. Find out whether plug agriculture, irrigation, and transplantation are prevalent in your state. If not, are there any alternative systems in use? Land grants provide some insight into the relationship between cultivators and the state. However, there were people who were often beyond the reach of officials or samantas. Pastoralists, fisherfolk, and hunter gatherers, mobile or semi sedentary artisans, and shifting cultivators. Generally, such groups did not keep detailed records of their lives and transactions. The history of Pataliputra. Each city had a history of its own. Pataliputra, for instance, began as a village known as Pataligrama. Then, in the 5th century BC, the Magadhan rulers decided to shift their capital from Rajagaha to this settlement and renamed it. By the 4th century BC, it was the capital of the Mauryan Empire and one of the largest cities in Asia. Subsequently, its importance apparently declined when the Chinese pilgrim Zhongzhang visited the city in the 7th century CE. He found it in ruins and with a very small population. Take a look at figure 2.6, the gift of an image. This is part of an image from Mathura. On the pedestal is a Prakrit inscription mentioning that a woman named Nagapiya, the wife of a goldsmith Shavanika named Dharmaka, installed this image in a shrine. Towns and trade, new cities. Let us retrace our steps back to the urban centers that emerged in several parts of the subcontinent from 6th century BCE. As we have seen, many of these were capitals of Mahajanapadas. Virtually all major towns were located along routes of communication. Some, such as Pataliputra, were on riverine routes, others, such as Ujjaini, were along land routes, and yet others, such as Puhar, were near the coast from where sea routes began. Many cities like Mathura were bustling centers of commercial, cultural, and political activity. Urban populations, elites, and craftspersons. We have seen that kings and ruling elites lived in fortified cities, although it is difficult to conduct extensive excavations at most sites because people live in these areas even today, unlike the Harappan cities. A wide range of artifacts have been recovered from them. These include fine pottery bowls and dishes with a glossy finish known as northern black polished ware, probably used by rich people, and ornaments, tools, weapons, vessels, figurines made of a wide range of materials: gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, glass, shell, and terracotta. Take a look at map 3. Some important kingdoms and towns. Kings, farmers, and towns. Were there any cities in the region where the Harappan civilization flourished in the 3rd millennium BC? By the 2nd century BC, we find short votive inscriptions in a number of cities. These mention the name of the donor and sometimes specify his her occupation as well. They tell us about people who lived in towns, washing folk, weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, officials, religious teachers, merchants and kings. Sometimes guilds or shrines, organizations of craft producers and merchants are mentioned as well. These guilds probably procured raw materials, regulated production, and marketed the finished product. It is likely that craftsperson used a range of iron tools to meet the growing demands of urban elites. Votive inscriptions record gifts made to religious institutions. The Malabar coast present day Kerala. Here is an excerpt from Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, composed by an anonymous Greek sailor, 1st century CE. They, that is traders from abroad, send large ships to these market towns on account of the great quantity and bulk of pepper and malbhatram, possibly cinnamon produced in these regions. There are imported here in the first place a great quantity of coin, topaz, antimony, a mineral used as a coloring substance, coral, crude glass, copper, tin, lead. That is exported pepper which is produced in quantity in only one region near these markets. Besides these three are exported great quantities of fine pearls, ivory, silk, cloth, transparent stones of all kinds, diamonds and sapphires and tortoise shell. Archaeological evidence of a bead making industry using precious and semi precious stones had been found in Kodumanal, Tamil Nadu. It is likely that local traders brought the stones mentioned in the Periplus from sites such as these to the coastal ports. Why did the author compile this list? Periplus is a Greek word meaning sailing around, and Erythraean was the Greek name for the Red Sea. Trade in the subcontinent and beyond. From the 6th century BCE, land and river routes crisscrossed the subcontinent and extended in various directions overland into Central Asia and beyond, and overseas from ports that dotted the coastline, extending across the Arabian Sea to East and North Africa and West Asia, and through the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia and China. Rulers often attempted to control these routes, possibly by offering protection for a price. Those who traversed these routes included peddlers who probably traveled on foot and merchants who traveled with caravans of bullock carts and pack animals. Also, there were seafarers whose ventures were risky but highly profitable. Successful merchants designated as Masathuvan in Tamil and Sethis and Satavahas in Prakrit could become enormously rich. A wide range of goods were carried from one place to another. Salt, grain, cloth, metal ores, and finished products, stone, timber, medical plants, to name a few species, especially pepper, were in high demand in the Roman Empire, as were textiles and medicinal plants, and these were all transported across the Arabian Sea to the Mediterranean. Coins and kings. To some extent, exchanges were facilitated by the introduction of coinage, punch market coins made of silver and copper. 6th century BC onwards were amongst the earliest to be minted and used. These have been recorded from excavations at a number of sites throughout the subcontinent. Numismatics have studied these and other coins to reconstruct possible commercial networks. Attempts made to identify the symbol on punch market coin with the specific ruling dynasties, including the Mauryas, suggest that these were issued by kings. It is also likely that merchants, bankers, and townspeople used some of these coins. The first coins to bear the names and images of rulers were issued by the Indo-Greeks who established control over the northwestern part of the subcontinent 2nd century BC. The Kushanas, however, issued the largest hoards of gold coins, first gold coins, that 1st century CE. These were virtually identical in weight with those issued by contemporary Roman empires and the Parthian rulers of Iran, and have been found from several sites in North India and Central Asia. The widespread use of gold coins indicates the numerous value of the transactions that were taking place. Besides, hoards of Roman coins have been found from archaeological sites in South India. It is obvious that networks of trade were not confined within political boundaries. South India was not part of the Roman Empire, but there were close connections through trade. Coins were also issued by tribal republics such as that of the Yadu- Yadhayas of Punjab and Haryana, 1st century CE. Archaeologists have unearthed several thousand copper coins issued by the Yaduyas, pointing to the latter's interest and participation in economic exchanges. Some of the most spectacular gold coins were issued by the Gupta rulers. The earliest issues are remarkable for their purity. These coins facilitated long distance transactions from which kings also benefited. From 6 from c. 6th century or CA onwards, finds of gold coins taper off. Does this indicate that there was some kind of an economic crisis? Historians are divided on this issue. Some suggest that with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, long distance trade declined, and this affected the prosperity of the states, communities, and regions that had benefited from it. Others argue that new towns and networks of trade started emerging around this time. They also point out that though finds of coins of that time are fewer, coins continue to be mentioned in inscriptions and texts. Could it be that there are fewer finds because coins were in circulation rather than being hoarded? Numismatics is the study of coins, including visual elements such as the scripts and images, metallurgical analysis, and the contexts in which they have been found. Take a look at figure 2.7, a punch marked coin. So named because symbols were punched or stamped onto the metal surface. Figure 2.8, a Yaduyana coin. Take a look at figure 2.9, a Gupta coin. Discuss what are the transactions involved in trade. Which of these transactions are apparent from the sources mentioned? Are there any that are not evident from the sources? Take a look at figure 2.10 and Ashokan inscriptions. Take a look at figure 2.11, Ashokan Brahmi with Devanagari equivalents. Do some Devanagari letters appear similar to Brahmi? Are there any that seem different? Back to basics, how are inscriptions differed? So far, we have been studying excerpts from inscriptions among us other things, but how do historians find out what is written on them? Differing Brahmi. Most scripts used to write modern Indian languages are derived from Brahmi, the script used in most Ashokan inscriptions from the late 18th century. European scholars aided by Indian Pandits worked backwards from contemporary Bengal and Devanagari, the script used to write Hindi manuscripts, comparing their letters with older specimens. Scholars who studied early inscriptions sometimes assumed these were in Sanskrit, although only after decades of painstaking investigations by several epigraphists that James Prinsep was able to decipher Ashokan Brahmi in 1838. How Kharoshti was read. The story of the deferment of Kharoshti, the script used in inscriptions in the northwest, is different. Here, finds of coins of Indo Greek kings who ruled over the area. Second first centuries BC have facilitated matters. These coins contain the names of kings written in Greek and Kharoshti scripts. European scholars who could read the former compared the letters. For instance, the symbol for A could be found in both scripts for writing names such as Apollodotus, with the Princip identifying the language of the Kharosthi inscriptions as Prakrit. It became possible to read longer inscriptions as well. Historical evidence from inscriptions. To find out how epigraphists and historians work, let us look at the two Ashokan inscriptions more closely. Note that the name of the ruler Ashoka is not mentioned in the inscription source 10. What is used instead are titles adopted by the ruler Devanampya, Devanampya, often translated as beloved of the gods and Priyadasi, or pleasant to behold. The name Ashoka is mentioned in some other inscriptions which also contain these titles. After examining all these inscriptions and finding that they match in terms of content, style, language, and paleography, epigraphists have concluded that they were issued by the same ruler. You may also have noticed that Ashoka claims that earlier rulers had no arrangements to receive reports. If you consider the political history of the subcontinent prior to Ashoka, do you think this statement is true? Historians have to constantly assess statements made in inscriptions to judge whether they're true, plausible, or exaggerations. Did you notice that there are words within brackets? Epigraphists sometimes add these to make the meaning of sentences clear. This has to be done carefully to ensure that the intended meaning of the other is not changed. The orders of the king. The speaks king Devanampiya Piyadasi. In the past, there were no arrangements for disposing affairs, not for receiving regular reports. But I have made the following arrangement. Pativedakas should report to me about the affairs of the people at the all times, anywhere, whether I am eating in the inner apartment, in the bedroom, in the cow pen, being carried possibly in a plankin, or in the garden, and I will dispose of the affairs of the people everywhere. Epigraphists have translated the term Pativedaka as reporter. In what ways would the functions of the Pativedaka have been different from those we generally associate with reporters today? Take a look at figure 2.1 to a coin of the Indo-Greek coin Menander. The anguish of the king. When the king Devanampiya Piyadasi has been ruling for 8 years, the country of the Kalinga's present day coastal Orissa was conquered by him. 150,000 men were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many more died. After that, now that the country of the Kalingas has been taken, Devanampiya is devoted to an intense study of Dhamma, to the love of Dhamma, and to instructing the people in Dhamma. This is the repentance of Devanampiya on account of his conquest of the country of the Kalingas. For this is considered very painful and deplorable by Devanampiya that while one is conquering an unconquered country, slaughter, death, and deportation of people take place there. Discuss. Look at map 2 and discuss the location of Ashokan inscriptions. Do you notice any patterns? Historians have to make other assessments as well. If a king's order were inscribed on natural rocks near sites or important routes of communication, would passerby have stopped to read this? Most people were probably not literate. Did everybody throughout the subcontinent understand the Prakrit used in Pataliputra? Would the orders of the king have been followed? Answers to such questions are not always easy to find. Some of these problems are evident if we look at an Asokan inscription, source 11, which has often been interpreted as reflecting the anguish of the ruler, as well as marking a change in his attitude towards warfare. As we shall say, the situation becomes more complex once we move beyond reading the inscriptions at face value. While Ashokan inscriptions have been found in present-day Orissa, the one depicting his anguish is missing. In other words, the inscription has not been found in the region that was conquer. What are we to make of that? Is it that the anguish of the recent conquest was too painful in the region and therefore the ruler was unable to address the issue? The limitations of inspirational evidence. By now, it is probably evident that there are limits to what epigraphy can reveal. Sometimes there are technical limitations, letters are very faintly engraved and thus reconstructions are uncertain. Also, inscriptions may be damaged or letters missing. Besides, it is not always easy to be sure about the exact meaning of the words used in inscriptions, some of which may be specific to a particular place or time. If you go through an epigraphical journal, some are listed in timeline too. You will realize that scholars are constantly debating and discussing alternative ways of reading inscriptions. Although several thousand inscriptions have been discovered, not all have been deciphered, published, and translated. Besides, many more inscriptions must have existed which have not survived the ravages of time. So, what is available at present is probably only a fraction of what was inscribed. There is another, perhaps more fundamental problem. Not everything that we may consider politically or economically significant was necessarily recorded in inscriptions. For instance, routine agricultural practices and the joys and sorrows of daily existence find no mention in inscriptions, which focus more often than not on grand unique events. Besides, the confident to inscriptions almost invariably projects the perspective of the personals who commissioned them. As such, they need to be juxtaposed with other perspectives so as to arrive at a better understanding of the past. Take a look at figure 2.13, a copper plate inscription from Karnataka, 6th century. Thus, epigraphy alone does not provide a full understanding of political and economic history. Also, historians often question both the old and new evidence. Scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were primarily interested in these histories of kings. From the mid 20th century onwards, issues such as economic change and the ways in which different social groups emerged have assumed far more importance. Recent decades have seen a much greater preoccupation with the histories of marginalized groups. This will probably lead to fresh investigations of old sources and the development of new strategies of analysis. Timeline 1. Major political and economic developments 600 to 500 BCE. Paddy transplantation, urbanization in the Ganga Valley Mahajanapadas, punch-marked coins. C. 500 to 400 BCE. Rulers of Magadha consolidate power 327 to 325. Invasion of Alexander of Macedon 321. Accession of Chandragupta Maurya 272 to 268 to 231. Reign of Ashoka 185. End of the Mauryan Empire 200 to 100. Indo-Greek rule in the northwest, Cholas, Cheras and Pandyas in South India, Shatavahanas in the Deccan 100 to 200 CE. Shaka peoples from Central Asia ruled in the northwest. Roman trade gold coinage 78 CE. Accessions of Kanishka 100 to 200 CE. Earliest inscriptional evidence of land grants by Shatavahanas and Shaka rulers 320. Beginning of Gupta rule 335 to 375 Samudragupta 375 to 415 Chandragupta II Vakatakas in the Deccan 500 to 600 Rise of the Chalukyas in Karnataka and of the Pallavas in Tamil Nadu 606 to 647 Harshavardhana, king of Kanauj, Chinese pilgrim Zhongzhang comes in search of a Buddhist text. 7th world Arabs conquer Sindh. Note: it is difficult to date economic developments preciously. Also, there are enormous subcontinental variations which have not been indicated in the timeline. Only the earliest dates for specific developments have been given. The dates of Kanishka's accession is not certain and this has been marked with a question mark. Timeline 2. Major advances in epigraphy. 18th century, 1784, founding of the Asiatic Society, Bengal. 19th century, 1810s, Colin Maxon Mackenzie collects over 8,000 inscriptions in Sanskrit and Dravidian languages. 1838, deferment of Ashokan Brahmi by James Princip. 1877, Alexander Cunningham publishes a set of Ashokan inscriptions. 1886, first issue of Epigraphia Carnatica, a journal of South Indian inscriptions. 1888, first issue of Epigraphia Indica. 20th century, 1965 to 66, D.C. Sircar publishes Indian Epigraphy and Indian Epigraphical Glossary. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Question number 1. Discuss the evidence of craft production in early historic cities. In what ways is this different from the evidence from Harappan sites? Describe the question number 2. Describe the salient features of Mahajanapadas. Question number 3. How do historians reconstruct the lives of ordinary people? Question number 4. Compare and contrast the list of things given to the Panjyan chief source 3 with those produced in the village of Danguna source 8. Do you notice any similarities or differences? List some of the problems faced by epigraphists. Write a short essay about 500 words on the following. Question number 6. Discuss the main features of Mauryan administration. Which of these elements are evident in the Ashokan inscription that you have studied? Question number 7. This is a statement made by one of the best known epigraphists of the 12th century, D.C. Sircar. There is no aspect of life, culture, and activities of the Indians that is not reflected in inscriptions discussed. Question number 8. Discuss the notions of kingship that developed in the post-Mauryan period. Question number 9. To what extent were agriculture practices transformed in the period under consideration? Map work. Question number 10. Compare maps 1 and 2 and list the Mahajanapadas that might have been included in the Mauryan Empire. Are any Ashokan inscriptions found in these areas? Project any one. 11. Correct newspaper for 1 month. Cut and paste all the statements made by government officials about public works. Note what the reports say about the resources required for such projects, how the resources are mobilized, and the objects of the project. Who issues the statements and how and why are they communicated? Compare and contrast these with the evidence from inscriptions discussed in the chapter. What are the similarities and differences that you notice? Question number 12. Collect 5 different kinds of currency notes and coins in circulation today. For each one of these, describe what you see on the observer and the reverse, the front and the back. Prepare a report on the common features as well as the differences in terms of pictures, scripts and languages, size, shape, and any other element that you find significant. Compare this with the coins shown in this chapter, discussing the materials used, the techniques of minting, the visual symbols and their significance, and the possible functions that coins may have had. For more information, you could visit. Thank you.